The title of my conference tonight is, well, the sum of the parts. I'm not gonna, the idea was initially that I would talk about numbers. I won't talk that much about numbers, but it will be nonetheless, let's say, talk about the cost of things, and in particular the cost of reuse. So let's get starting. As you know, this is a picture of Rotor like 5 years ago. In the meanwhile, we're a bigger group. We're 9 fixed members now, people with a very different backgrounds, pretty complementary background. We have a series of architects in the group, but not everybody is an architect. Initially, we just had one website on which we were throwing all of our projects. Now we started to make some order in what we do. And as you will see, it's slightly, I mean, we have 4 headings for the moment. So it's research, design, exhibitions, and books. It's a bit rough as a division, but I think it rather pretty well spans or covers the span of our activities. I will start with saying something about what we do in terms of design, and that's going to be the first section of my talk. And when we talk, or when I do presentations about the design of Rotor, I often show this slide, which illustrates like the classical division of activities in the building sector. What you see is, on the one hand, on your left-hand side, is the activity of the architect and the products that are the outcome of the activity of the architects, which are a set of plans and drawings, which are the instructions that are handed over through that dotted line to the realm of the builder. So by definition, the architects are not touching any matter, and all the realization is delegated to another entity, which is the contractor, obviously. And also, like handling the building materials, that's all left to the contractor. He's also purchasing or buying the building materials and putting them in place. But let's say the existence of that very strict division between activities is mostly legal. I mean, it's been done for legal reasons, but it's pretty inescapable. Now, much of what we do is try to mess up that division as an actor. So we don't define ourselves strictly as architects, but we are ourselves also active as contractors on the building side. Now, let me illustrate that concretely with the following project. So this is, it's a cultural center, or it's a place that had been completely renovated and was to become a cultural center. So initially it was this building, a slaughterhouse from the 1940s, late 1930s, in typical Henri van de Velde style, in the city of Namur. It's a derelict, or a difficult neighborhood behind the station. Now, in the whole process of renovating the place, the city has eventually agreed to renovate this building and to transform it into a cultural facility. Now, it was a design and build commission, so it was to become a low-energy building. Everything was insulated on the inside, so that you kept the external walls, but on the inside you had a kind of bleak, anonymous white space, which on top of that was completely unequipped to receive the cultural center as such. So the money was almost completely spent to the building or the renovation of the building, and at that point the commissioner, which is the cultural center itself, contacted us asking to equip the whole thing for a small amount of money. So and the equipment was, I mean, it was like toilet roll holders that needed to be placed, until a whole office that needed to be equipped, and everything in terms of facility for the studios. So you had lots of creative studios, including the photography studio had to be equipped. Now, so this was like a studio, what a studio was looking like when we arrived. Now, we designed a full set of equipment that looks like this if represented in SketchUp, very simply. But it was an awful lot of material, and the budget was super tight. So it was decided from the beginning that we would resort as much as possible to second-hand materials. Now, I'm not going to talk about the whole project, but I will just focus on a few dimensions of it. And especially, you can imagine if you have to equip a central like that, one of the functions you need to cover mostly is storage. You need to provide storage that is elegant, functional, etc. Now, while we were designing this project, we were also, at some point, we had access to this building, which is an important office building next to the Royal Palace in Brussels, and which was rented for a long while by an electricity company in Belgium, Electrabel. Now, the owners told us, like, have a look around and see what is of interest to you, and then you can pick it and have it. And when we looked around, we saw these rows and rows of, every level was covered with that wood paneling. And when we looked at it in detail, it looked pretty bleak, let's say. It was a rather dull wood veneer on the outside when you look at these doors, but when we opened the cupboards, we saw that the inside was far more lively. And let's say the reason that is so is because they used so-called B, or like second-rate veneer on the inside. But actually, seen from our perspective, that second-rate veneer is far more interesting than the first-rate veneer. And so on the lower levels, which were the most public levels, you had on the outside of every door a pretty dull veneer. And then when you went up to the fourth, fifth, and sixth level, you got spaces where you had that beautiful veneer even on the outside of the doors. What we then did was shopping in that building. We selected the doors that we found interesting. We kept the series. We numbered everything, and we started dismantling it. And then we brought the whole thing to Namur, our destination. It was a pretty complex operation that involved like identifying different types of closing mechanisms. So this bucket we had to design on purpose to classify all these closing mechanisms. So we had slightly underestimated it, but still it was really worth the investment in terms of financial and also time gain. And then we reinstalled all these cupboards in the cultural center. It took some custom designing here and there to like create additional openings and etc. But it was like, I think in total 80 cupboard units, 4 entire trucks filled with cupboards that were brought over to there. And one thing we had brought along as well was like additional stacks of doors for these cupboards in case we would not have enough, or some of them would have gotten damaged during transport. And these allowed us to make some supplementary designs, like this element here is represented in the plan in the yellow parts here. So this is the plan, or it's also a SketchUp drawing, but that's the document that it was like our final plan as a proposal to the commissioner. So you have to imagine we developed the project. It's a very interactive project where we discussed with lots of local partners. We did a lot of sourcing or identifying of materials, but still the result was kind of abstract scheme proposal. But that was not concrete in terms of how exactly we were going to build things. And so when we started intervening on the spot, so we've been living like 2 months on the spot, building the stuff ourselves there. At that point, before starting, we didn't know exactly how these cupboards were going to be realized. So these are elements that separate 2 parts of the office, or, I mean, as you can see here, It's like 40 centimeters wide, 120 high. It's to be used to stack books in, and on the other hand, it has to create some privacy for the office spaces, and it has to be sound absorbing. So we also had these elements in stock since 2010. These are just radiator coverings from a building that is dating back to the 1970s. You don't see that anymore today, but it was very popular at that period. It's plywood that is curved and covered with melamine, usually very strong melamine, so it's a very resistant material. Usually when we see that, we always take it away and we store it apart, because we know at some point it's going to be useful for a project. And then we remembered that material and we brought it back to Namur, and eventually designed these separation elements with these radiator covers. So this is the assembly, and as you see, the horizontal elements are these extra cupboard doors that we use for that, and that's the result we get from it. So it's a pretty simple intervention, but it allows also the integration of electricity in these units. So we don't have to touch the floors, we don't have to touch the ceiling, and we have electricity that is spread all over the office. All the other elements that you see here, like the tables, the chairs, are also second-hand materials that we buy. We have like a network of connections in Europe, and it's always possible to find these materials cheaply and of good quality. And then we still had some wood left with which we built these lightning elements. So one of the challenges we had is that there was one point of light for the whole ceiling. We didn't want to touch the ceiling, so we had to invent a lighting system for that office floor, which would spread out over the whole office and illuminate specifically all the desks. And then we designed the lighting system as a kind of tree that was extending over the ceiling. And it integrates some highly efficient office lighting elements that are to be, normally these are to be inbuilt, but here we use them like in a box. Now, I guess this illustrates it's a process of designing in advance, sourcing materials, bringing the materials together, and designing on the spot, which is a process that takes some time, but it also takes like the confidence of your commissioner. The reason why we could do this project as such is also because we were working on under let's say a slightly particular let's say under circumstances that are not usual for an interior design project. This was conceived as a kind of artistic intervention, and since it was commissioned by a cultural center, it was possible to conceive it like that. But still, it's not something we would repeat as an experience, and we will probably not find the right context to work like that. So much of what we do is to try and find the right circumstances, to be able to integrate reused materials in what we do, or to help others integrating them, but it's not always that easy to achieve as a goal. So here I start the second part of what I intended to say. As you know, Rotor is, let's say, our main focus is the materials economy. And the materiality in general, and the materiality of building processes. And one thing that is of interest to us, and it was the topic of our intervention for the Belgian pavilion at the 2010 Biennale, is the way materials are wearing off. And the whole process of slow degradation of materials, as in this project Usure, is something that, of course, echoes in physics, in the form of, well, the law of entropy. I don't know how well you remember your physics course, but the law of entropy stipulates that when you have a closed system, the level of disorder within that closed system will only increase. It can never decrease. So locally, you can have, like in the biosphere on Earth, you can have local increases of order, but it will always be at the cost of creating greater disorder somewhere else. Now, there is like in medieval and Renaissance wisdom, that you might say that the notion of entropy is represented by the figure of Father Time, which in turn is a reimagining of Kronos, the father of Zeus and many other Greek gods. As you know, Kronos, the god of time, or the titan of time, was also eating his own children. And that is what is represented in this engraving, which is a 17th century engraving that made by a French painter. And it illustrates the effects of time on antiquities. And you see Kronos, or Father Time, who is literally eating Roman antiquities, and that's the way that people from the Renaissance were inheriting these elements. Now, we see some parallel between that figure of Kronos and this machine. Now, do you know what this is? It's called a jaw crusher. It's a machine that's used to crush like inert building materials and transform it into rubble. So the idea is it's like two elements that vibrate and they crush. If you would throw a big block of marble or granite into it, it would take just a few seconds to reduce that block, however strong it would be, into rubble. So that's the main destination of all inert materials of buildings that are to be demolished. So it's transformed into rubble, and that rubble is then used for foundation works or things like that. So you have to imagine that these materials will be transformed into this. Now, it's a material that had a certain value. Of course, it involves manipulations and it involves the energy input of the crusher. But at this point in Belgium, this material sells at €0 per ton. So the offer has exceeded demand, and it's just literally worth nothing. Just if you would go there at a sorting station in Belgium with a truck, you can have whole truckloads. They won't charge you anything for that. But for us, it's a loss of value. Like, what you lose is the inherent value of all the materials that were crushed into it. And we cannot help but finding that deplorable. Yeah. Now, it's important to know that the recycling industry in Western Europe has its roots in the situation of 1945. So after the bombings, you had in the big cities in Germany, but also in Milan and in other big cities in Europe, you had huge devastations and piles of rubble that had to be taken away. And then crushing that rubble and using it as foundations or landfill was one specific way of going ahead. Now, in a recent exhibition that just opened, we also showed this movie, which shows the alternative. I'm afraid the movie is not working. Okay, there it's coming. So these images have been filmed in Berlin, the part of Berlin that was occupied by the Russians. And there, the Russians, instead of using bulldozers, they just asked the population, and mainly the women, to clean up the rubble. And what these women are doing is just taking by hand with buckets the things apart, and they especially recuperate all the bricks that can be used for the rebuilding of parts of Berlin. And that's effectively what has happened. The name of these women is Trümmerfrauen. They're obviously also a symbolic figure, a way of presenting the German population in another way than criminals or perpetrators of crimes against humanity. So in that sense, it was an interesting move. But it's interesting to go back to that tradition as well, which is not so much American Western. It's more a kind of, it's something else. But something else that goes back to history. So another example I wanted to show is this. This is a tower from the 15th century in Antwerp that needed to be demolished in the 19th century. So what did they do? And that's like an age-old reflex. They published a poster on which they ask contractors to propose a price for buying the tower. So the idea is they take away the tower, but they take away the materials and they can keep the materials for themselves. So they pay for doing the demolition, which in effect is a dismantling. So like public authorities are sparing the money of having to take it away, and they earn money instead with these kinds of operations. So that is something that we as Rotor would try and encourage public authorities to do. And recently we brought out this study. Well, it's not really a study, we call it Vademecum. It's a manual for public authorities, first in Brussels, but then elsewhere in Belgium, that must help them when they have a building to tear down or to renovate heavily. We explain them how to proceed in order to have contractors paying them for recuperating certain materials in the building instead of them having to pay the contractors for taking it away. And it seems simple to do, but it is, in effect, is pretty complex if you want to respect the law of public procurement. So you know, normally when you're a public authority and you order works to be done, either building or demolishing works, there are specific rules, very important rules that you need to observe, and otherwise you go against the law. So what we did was writing a procedure that would help these public authorities to not to go against the law. And so it's a pretty complex document. We hired a lawyer especially to co-develop the whole thing with us. But then it contains, for instance, a whole set of like pre-formatted forms that these authorities can send and that will help them in getting the procedure right. So in yellow you have these type letters, for instance. Now, when you talk about the complexities and the incentives that you can have to do a demolition, to dismantle buildings instead of demolishing them, it's interesting to go and look at this example. This is an example from California, and there you have a group that is active, which is called the Reuse People. And what they do is they will go to this building, which is a villa that needs to be demolished, and they will literally deconstruct it. They take it apart, plank by plank, they denail all the planks, and they will resell them as one lot of materials. Now, the reason why this works well, so this is a view of the shop where they resell these materials. The reason why they can do this is because the tax regulation system in the US is completely different from the one we have here, which means that the owner of the building that you've seen can decide to donate the entirety of his building or of the components of his building to a non-profit organization like the Reuse People. It's a charity, and get a tax deduction of the amount of money that these planks are worth. And sometimes these amounts can be pretty important, so the tax benefit is pretty important as well. And that helps to compensate for the additional cost of a dismantling of the building, obviously, which is more time consuming, takes more people to do. So the whole system keeps itself in balance and everybody earns money, so to say. Unfortunately, that system is does not exist in Europe. It's not possible to get a tax deduction for a donation of materials like it is possible in the US. So it shows that fiscality is also an important element in making the salvaging of materials possible. So if you don't have that, you have to go and look for other means of proceeding. An important element as well to take into consideration, and when you want to look at the situation today, is what happened in the last decades, and especially in the last 10 or 15 years. That's what I show here, is that, let's say, the cost of landfilling materials has risen sharply. So that's also the state who decided to let's say, impose higher taxes on landfilling. So if you want to get rid of rubbish, before, that's the numbers we indicate here, before 2009 in Belgium you had to pay about 35 euro per ton. Now it's 60, and these prices will only increase, which is an important incentive for demolition contractors to go for recycling or for alternatives like the reuse of building materials. Now, in the efforts that we have done in trying to stimulate the reuse of building materials, an important work we did at some point was what we call Opalis, which is it's now a website. It's an inventory of all the existing Belgian resellers of building components. In the beginning, we thought you had only like 10 or 20 players. In the end, we discovered, after weeks and weeks of research, that you had 100 or more or less 100 resellers. So there is much more than you would think. They're very different in nature and in ways of functioning. They're usually specialized in some specific domains. So with most of them we had conversations, we tried to understand how they worked, when they started, why they started. And so that resulted in this website, which is like a detailed description of each of these players, but also a description of the main materials that are available on the market, on the existing market. Now, when you look at this map, you will see that there's only one player in Brussels, and that player is us, like Rotor Deconstruction. I will talk about that later, but it's important to understand that there is a kind of overlap between this map and this one, which is like an inverted overlap. This is a map of the property prices in terms of square meter in Belgium in general. And so you see that southern Belgium is definitely cheaper than northern Belgium, but you also can recognize the spots of the big cities, especially in Flanders, as spots of very high prices. That is pretty obvious, of course, but it has its implications on this map. So it means that these resellers of building materials, who usually need a lot of space to store their materials on, as you had seen on this picture. This is a typical storage of a reseller of building materials. They try to shun or to flee from the big cities and their higher rental prices. Now, it's as such that is a bit against the logic of the production of building and demolition waste, or these reusable materials are obviously mostly produced in city centers because the building activity is higher there. And one of the things we also realized is that when you look at the specificity of Brussels, so this is a map of the European neighborhood in Brussels, or it's a zoom in, on exactly the same area. On the left side, you see the situation in 1971. On the right side, it's the situation today, or 2012. And everything that is indicated in red on the left-hand side are buildings that have been torn down. So in the last 40 years or so, these buildings have been completely torn down. Have they been demolished because they were obsolete? No. They have been demolished because you have a high property speculation on these areas. So these are obviously it's let's say the property prices are the highest in the whole of Belgium and probably one of the highest in Europe in general. So you have a tremendous turnover of buildings there. And yeah, this is a diagram by one of the companies we are working together. It's a company that is renting out office spaces in Brussels. And this is a kind of overview of their clients, the nature of their clients. What is of interest mostly is the diagram on the upper right, which shows the average duration of the tenancies. So how long will one of these renters stay on the spot? And you see that almost a quarter of them are staying 3 years or less. Now you also have to imagine that each time in an office space that there is a change of renter or tenant, this is going to happen. So everything that is between the concrete floor and the concrete ceiling of that space is going to be emptied out completely. And all that goes into the container. Now, there's obviously an economic rationale to that, but it always shocks us when we see this happening, and it's also happening under our noses. Now, we find it also ironic, especially when, I mean, you probably all have heard about design for deconstruction, which is, I mean, especially in academia, certain researchers are working on that, and they say like, okay, as an architect, you don't have to use glue, you don't have to use nails, you have to use things that can be unscrewed, because if it's unscrewable, if it's dismountable, then it's going to be reused. Now the irony is that when you talk about office interior elements, these elements are all conceived to be pretty easy to dismount, but that doesn't happen. So there's a kind of gap between what is possible and what is being done. Now another thing that is important to show, I don't know if you're familiar with this book. It's an excerpt of How Buildings Learn, which is a book by Stuart Brand, the American biologist and journalist who started the whole Earth catalog in the 1960s. And who afterwards wrote a series of very important books, and his book on architecture is just an absolute classic to us. And in it, in the second chapter, he shows this diagram. The diagram on the left shows it's a figuration of the life cycles of the different layers of a building. So he imagines a building as a kind of combination of layers, and the thickness of the line represents the length of an average life cycle. So you see that the site has the longest life cycle, then the structure, then you have the skin of the building on the outside, and then everything that happens on the inside usually has a far shorter life cycle. Now, the other diagram you see on the right, on the left hand, sorry, is representing the accumulated expenses that a building represents over the years. So in dark gray, you have the structure, and then you have the services in lighter gray, and then lightest is the space plan. Now, in the beginning, the structure costs a lot, but when you look at the use of a building across a time lapse of 50 years, you will see that everything that happens inside, like the services and the space plan, is going to cost far more than the structure costed initially. So we have stuff that has been thrown away that is relatively expensive, and that's something we wanted to do something about. And that's the reason why we started Rotor Deconstruction. We're focusing on what's happening in Brussels. So this is an example. It's on the Schumann Square, which is right in the European district in Brussels. It's the prices are the highest there. You have 2 levels of an office block that was rented by General Electrics. This is the way we found the spaces when they were left empty by General Electrics. So everything looked super clean, beautiful, but you have to imagine that everything was destined to the container. So the way we proceed in these cases, and now we have developed a protocol, is that we identify all the elements that we deem feasible to dismantle and also economically interesting to dismantle, so sellable. We make a huge inventory of it with a few pictures and prices, and we sell that Excel list to all of our contacts, and they contact us back mentioning what they want to buy. Once we have all the orders, then we proceed with dismantling, and we only take out what has been sold already. We try not to take risks because we have seen too many examples of other initiatives around the world where people start acquiring things and then eventually they cannot sell it anymore. So it's always dangerous to fill up your warehouse. So we have a 1,500 square meter warehouse, but it's very quick to fill. So you have to be extremely, you have to watch out for that. So this is like a typical dismantling operations. In this case, you have these door elements with the internal wall systems. Lighting is always a big hit. And then these things are brought to, are immediately brought to the trucks of our clients who come to the building site itself. So the goods are not transiting to a warehouse, they immediately go to the client's place. And sometimes that can be an architect, sometimes it can be a contractor who integrates these elements in his project. Yeah, so this is, I will go quickly through that. It's just a representation of imagine on the left-hand side, you have the company that originally has installed these materials and then at the end of the life cycle has to throw them away. So you have in the black squares are representing the environmental impact in terms of emissions of every stage of that. And so you see that the treatment of the waste at the bottom is obviously involving a big environmental impact. And on the other hand, you would have another like customer who would be building something new again. In this first scenario, he has to go exactly the same steps with the exact same impact. In the second scenario, he's buying a second-hand material, and so he's sparing a lot of environmental impact. This is a diagram we propose for our clients, and many of these business people, they really need like hard data in terms of CO2 emissions. We weren't used to producing these, but we just learned to do it out of pure pragmatism. So this is a typical view of an office space when we arrive, and this is the view when we leave. So we just pick out what we find interesting, and the rest we're really sorry, but we have to leave it. Same thing in this case. So what we end up with is this. In the exhibition I was talking about, we literally exhibit this. I confess I've cheated a bit for this PowerPoint presentation or keynote presentation, but you have to imagine the sink on, it's a cleaner sink on the left-hand side is a new one, which sells at something like 325 euros. The other one on the right-hand side is a reused one. It sells at 75 euros. The model is exactly the same. You can hardly see that the left-hand one, the right-hand one has been used because it has been cleaned every day. It's in beautiful shape. So that's one of the items we sell at our shop. So yes, we have a shop now. So talking about second-hand materials, a few things I want to say, and here I'm not talking about what we sell, but other people are selling. So this is a company in Flanders, who close to Hofstade. They're completely specialized in reusing bricks. So they dismantle pre-existing structures, often housing from the 1950s, and they literally clean it by hand with a hatchet. So it's purely manual work. The workers who are doing this are paid 250 euro a day, but they have to clean 3,000 bricks a day. So it's pretty intense. So it's well paid and they're completely in order, but in terms of social security, etc. But the work rhythm is high, and obviously let's say the benefit that the company is making on this is really small and it's really fragile. But so we try to push these companies because we find that what they produce in terms of sustainable building materials is just uncomparable with whatever exists on the market. So these are beautiful bricks that can be, I mean, the production circumstances and the packaging and the delivery times are really comparable to what you would have with a new building material. And you can have beautiful results with it. This is a project made by Bluff Architecten, also a Flemish architecture office that has been published quite widely, I think. Now, the funny thing is that Wienerberger, who is the biggest producer of bricks in the world and has several sub-companies in different countries, including in Italy, they have identified the fact that the public is gaining interest in reused bricks. And now they brought on the market a brick called, this is Brabantse Recup. So it's faking a reused brick. So it's an industrially produced brick that is covered with a paste that is obviously applied by a machine, but a machine that imitates the erraticness of a reused brick. And it's looking like that. But it's this is the way they make the promotion of that material, with these kind of examples in their portfolio. I mean, when you download the PDF with the technical specification, you have that kind of example. Now, the reason why this is it's still going to be a success is because Wienerberger is very good at targeting people like you, that is architects who are going to implement these materials on a huge scale and who need all the guarantees that it's going to happen without any problem. So what they can offer is these technical guarantees, but so a kind of legal protection of the designer. What they also can offer is the necessary tools, such as the digital texture that you can just copy and paste and integrate in your models. So all that facilitates, so you have to mind as an architect, you're responsible for these kind of things. It facilitates the integration of these materials in architectural projects on a big scale. So what we tried to counterattack, and one of the things we did recently was to try and write also technical specifications that could be integrated in specifications even for bigger buildings that are detailing what the necessary, let's say, qualities and properties must be of reused second-hand bricks. And so we identified the most common standard types in Belgium and described them and gave them some specifications. We did that also for another material, which is pavement blocks, cobblestones. I'm going to go a bit more quickly through this because so what you see here are huge piles of reclaimed or salvaged cobblestones in Belgian sandstone. So these were cut by hand in the 19th century, early 20th century in Belgium. After a while, the cost of producing them by hand was too big and they stopped producing them. But let's say the question when somebody has to pave, when a public authority has to pave a street today is what kind of building or cobblestone am I going to use? If you want to use this grès du Condro, so the Condro sandstone, the Belgian sandstone today, new, it will cost you 90 euros per square meters. Now, there is an alternative on the market that is this stone, which is just called Kandla, which in reality is a sandstone with the same kind of color coming from India. It costs you 20 euros a square meter. Now, obviously, everybody will go for that one, and that has been the case for like 2 decades now. So most of Belgian public spaces are covered with this stone until they discovered. So it's sometimes it has problems. The quality of it is a bit less than the Belgian one. But the big problem about it is that it's produced in a region, Bhutpura, an extremely poor area in India, where entire families are put to work to produce them, which means that many kids are just doing that, cutting these stones all days. And recently in Belgium there has been a huge controversy because a journalist went to there and made a long reportage on it, and eventually had the confirmation that these are cut by kids. So obviously for many people it was unacceptable, and so they declared, or like public authorities declared publicly that they didn't want to endorse this material anymore. So when I go back then to the reused, salvaged cobblestones, the ones that I've shown there, these will cost you like 50 euros a square meter. So it's still more expensive than the Kandla, but it's far less expensive than the new one. Now, yeah, I'm gonna skip this. Shorten, yeah, then I will skip this as well. This was about the perverse effects of reuse, but we can talk about that later. In the kind of buildings we are brought to dismantle, sometimes these are like anonymous buildings. Sometimes we also have like more exceptional buildings, as this one, which is the headquarters of the biggest bank of Belgium. It's now BNP Paribas Fortis. It's a building that, especially on the inside, it's dating back to the 1970s, but especially on the inside, it's really beautiful. It was designed by Jules Waps, who's one of the most important post-war Belgian designers. These are also very difficult circumstances to work in, because negotiating was directly with the bank for us. So we had a 60 pages document that was the agreement between us and the bank about how to proceed. And one of the things that was agreed upon is that we would try to salvage elements out of a kind of heritage perspective. So if possible, we would keep components that we had salvaged out of the building together in a new project. And so this is the underground bar of this building, designed by another designer. But we dismantled that, and we were able to recompose it more or less complete in another location, which is that cultural center I was talking about earlier. So this is the bar of the cultural center that has taken over like this counter, this cappuccino bar, the chairs, the table surfaces, yeah, all the tables you see there, these chairs, and even the lowered ceiling in massive oak comes from there, and these elements. So that was one way of we could deal and negotiate with them. Tough choices had to be made, like they had beautiful lowered ceilings, but these lowered ceilings were completely adapted to the module of the bank building, so it's impossible to reintegrate somewhere else, so we had to leave them. There were other lowered ceilings. These are acoustic panels. You have to imagine them like suspended to a ceiling, like the L shapes positioned like that. And these you can hang anywhere. So these ones we kept and we dismantled. You see them here packaged, ready to leave the building. We took some beautiful Italian granite, and we took the doorknobs in cast bronze away. So this is the two executive floors are connected by a magnificent staircase, which is in massive wenge, which is one of the most expensive exotic hardwoods. It's a combination of wenge and bronze. And so we're looking for a buyer for this one, and if we come up with a buyer with a good price, then the whole staircase will be lifted out of the building with a crane. At the moment, they've demolished the roof of the building. So yeah, this is just to show that we have to deal, in these old buildings, we have to deal a lot with asbestos. And we have to operate in buildings that are marked everywhere with the A on the wall, which means that there is asbestos behind the paneling there. So it means that you have to adapt the whole procedure, wear protective masks and clothes and etc. You have to keep also in mind that one very important aspect of being in the selling business is to present your goods. And so this is a picture that we took in a company in Denmark, which is called Genbik. And they do more or less what we do, but very professionally for a long while. And this is the way they take pictures of everything they are brought to sell there. So they have a huge photo studio, and this is their website. This is our photo studio in our warehouse. And so this is our website, Rotor Deconstruction, with the kind of stuff we sell. Yeah, just some little details that you have to keep in mind when you sell stuff. This was sold on an auction, so like the most exclusive pieces, we sell them at art and design auctions. So we sold this element and that bench. They're both from the same designer, a building from 1937. It's both steel and massive oak. It comes from an auditorium. Now, the funny thing is that these two things sold at 1,500 euros, and this just couldn't find a buyer. Nobody was ready to pay for it. So there you realize that there is something that is counterintuitive or unlogical about sales market, and you have to take it into consideration. The reason why people want these things is that they're very simple to carry away and to screw to your wall, and things are done. While this needs to be put on a stepped floor like this, it's really an auditorium equipment, so that's complicated. Now, the last example I'm going to show, and then I'll be finished. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's just this building wanted to show that we have taken out the tiles here. So it's a building that's going to be thoroughly renovated, but all the interior furnishings are going to be taken away. So we identified the 1930 tiles as interesting, and we found that, so we dismantled them, but before dismantling them, we made like an identification of the different tile types, and we also realized that every room in the building had a different Art Deco tile pattern. So we made a kind of a map of every of these rooms, and then we calculated the proportion of each tile type you needed to make that pattern. And so we made a booklet out of that, and we distributed that booklet in PDF. And our clients then reacted to that, and yeah, one client, which is an architecture office, an interior architecture office, they decided to play the game. So they conceived for a shop, which is also a grocery store bar. They conceived the floor that is sampling different of these patterns and bringing them together. So you have a very interesting floor arising there. I just wanted to show that, and this is the laying of that floor. So after having ordered the right amounts of each of these tile types. That's the shop today. Now, you remember the doors that I showed in the beginning of my lecture of these cupboards? So this is what happened to the other doors that we didn't take away, or the other cupboards in that building.
Thank you so much.